Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the History Desk. I'm Jonathan, and thank you for joining us. Last episode, we started our series on the American Revolutionary War, discussing the lead-up over many years to the armed conflict that would come. In this episode, we are going to discuss the Battle of Lexington and Concord, first shots of the war, and the aftermath of those battles. So let's get started. As we discussed in last week's episodes, the members of the colonies were very upset about the passing and enforcement of the Intolerable Acts by the British. When the Massachusetts Government Act of 1774 effectively abolished the provincial government of Massachusetts, General Thomas Gage, who was already Commander-in-Chief of British troops in North America, was also appointed military governor of Massachusetts in May of 1774, and was instructed by the government of King George to enforce royal authority in the troublesome colony. However, popular resistance compelled many of the newly appointed officials in Massachusetts to resign and seek refuge in Boston. General Gage commanded 4 regiments of British regulars, about 4,000 men, from his headquarters in Boston, but the countryside was controlled by Patriot sympathizers. Seeking to prevent the outbreak of hostilities and keep the peace between American patriots and the Loyalist minority in the region, General Gage believed the best way to accomplish this was to secretly remove military stores from storehouses and arsenals in New England. The secrecy of these missions was paramount, as General Gage feared the leak of any plans could result in the seizure or concealment of the stores by Patriot sympathizers before his men could get there. There were several places throughout the colonies where British Army had stockpiled supplies. Some of these were fortifications that were manned by small garrisons, and other were merely locked magazines. Most of the gunpowder in these was under the control of the provincial government, though some of these was the property of the individual towns. One locked storehouse was near Boston, in what was part of Charlestown, now Powder House Square in Somerville. This storehouse was controlled by William Brattle, leader of the provincial militia and an appointee of the governor. Brattle, who had not obviously sided with either the Loyalists or the Patriots, notified General Gage in a letter on which was dated August 27th that provincial or king's powder was the only supply remaining in the storehouse, as the town had removed all of theirs. General Gage decided that this powder had to be brought to Boston for safekeeping. On August 31st, Gage sent Middlesex County Sheriff David Phipps to Brattle with orders to remove the provincial powder. Brattle turned the key to the powder house over to Phipps. Gage also gave orders to ready a force of troops for action the next day, something that did not go unnoticed by the local Boston population. At some point that day, General Gage, whether by incident, accident, or theft by local messenger, lost possession of Brattle's letter. It is widely believed that it was dropped on accident. News of its contents spread rapidly, and many considered it to be a warning to Gage to remove the provincial power before Patriots could seize it. Early on the morning of September 1st, a force of about 260 British regulars from the 4th Regiment, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel George Madison, was rowed in secrecy up the river from Boston to a landing near Winter Hill. From there, they marched about a mile to the powder house. Once there, Phipps gave the king's troops the keys to the building, and after sunrise they removed all of the gunpowder. Most of the regulars returned to Boston the same way they had come, but a small group marched to Cambridge and removed 2 cannons and took them back to Boston by foot over the Great Bridge and up Boston Neck. The cannon and powder were then taken from Boston to the British stronghold on Castle Island, then known as Castle William. Rumors of the raid, if you could call it that, flew throughout the day across the countryside about British troop movements. The regulars were marching, provincial powder was been seized, war was at hand, people had been killed, Boston was being bombarded by His Majesty's warships. The alarm spread as far as Connecticut. From all over the region, people took up arms and began streaming towards Boston. One traveler in Shrewsbury reported that in a matter of 15 minutes, 50 men had gathered, equipped themselves, sent out messengers to surrounding towns, and began streaming towards Boston. On September 2nd, several thousand men gathered in Cambridge, where they forced several notable Loyalists and cruising William Brattle to flee to Boston and the protection of the military. Sheriff Phipps was forced, in writing, to disassociate himself from any and all government actions. Eventually, facts caught up with the rumors, and malicious units, many were still headed to Boston, returned home. General Gage, surprised by the size and scope of the colonial reaction, delayed and eventually canceled a second planned expedition to the storehouse in Worcester. He centralized his troops in Boston and called for reinforcements from London. Gage's request was seen by many to be absurd, as there were only 12,000 troops in Britain at the time, but he did eventually receive an additional 400 Marines in response to his request. He later began planning and executing seizures again, and he further fortified the Boston Peninsula. After these events, which would become known as the Powder Alarm, militia forces throughout New England were more cautious with their supplies and more intent on gaining any information about Gage's plan and troop movements. Paul Revere would play a significant role in distributing this information because of his geographical location in Boston, his social position as a middle-class craftsman in contact with all social classes, and his political position as a well-known patriot propagandist and organizer. On September 21st, Patriot leaders met in Worcester and urged town meetings to organize a third of the militia into special companies of Minutemen in constant readiness. They also instituted the system of express riders and alarms that would prove to be crucial in the days to come. In October, the former legislature of Massachusetts met in defiance of the Massachusetts Government Act and declared itself to be the first provincial Congress. In creating a committee of safety modeled after a body which of the same name during the English Civil War, and it recommended that a quarter of the militia be designated Minutemen. Military stores were to be stockpiled away from the coast or more than a day's march for British military to make an attempt to make it more difficult. The largest stockpiles were at Concord and Worcester. Early in December, British military command voted to prohibit the export of arms and powder to North America and to secure all remaining stores. On December 12th, intelligence received by Paul Revere indicated that a seizure of the stores at Fort William and Mary in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, was imminent. He rode from Boston to Portsmouth and the next day to notify the local patriots, who quickly raided the fort on December 14th and removed supplies. Revere's intelligence had been incorrect, though. Although a British operation had been contemplated, it had not been ordered. The British did send ships carrying troops to Portsmouth, and they arrived 3 days after the fort's supplies were removed. The first arrived on December 17th and was directed into shallows at high tide by a local pilot, much to the captain's anger. Stores of gunpowder were also carried off from forts in New Britain Province, Rhode Island, and New London, Connecticut, and distributed to militias in towns away from the coast. Cannon and other supplies were smuggled out of Boston and Charlestown. On February 27, 1775, HMS Livery brought a force of 240 British regulars from the 64th Regiment under Colonel Alexander Leslie to confiscate weapons in Salem, Massachusetts. They were stopped by a small crowd that raised a drawbridge in their path and taunted them, while others moved the cannon to safety and sent for help from nearby towns. Eventually, the drawbridge was lowered, and the regulars were permitted to search the forge where the cannon had once been. They returned to their ship, while being mocked by a growing force of irregulars marching along in step next to them. There were minor scuffles, but no shots were fired. Having been considered in a state of rebellion since February of 1775, on April 14th of 1775, General Gage received instructions from Secretary of State William Legge, Earl of Dartmouth, to disarm the rebels and to imprison their leaders. Legge gave Gage considerable discretion in these commands. Gage's decision to act promptly may have been influenced by the information he received on April 15th from a spy in the Provincial Congress that although the Congress was still divided on the need for armed resistance, delegates had been sent to other New England colonies to see if they would cooperate in raising a New England army of 18,000 colonial soldiers. On the morning of April 19th, Gage ordered a mounted patrol of 20 men under the command of Major Mitchell of the 5th Regiment of Foot into the surrounding country to intercept messengers that might be on horseback. The patrol behaved differently from patrols sent out of Boston in the past by staying out after dark and asking travelers about the location of Samuel Adams and John Hancock. This had the unintended effort of alarming many residents and increasing their preparedness. The Lexington militia in particular started to muster early that evening, even before word from Boston had arrived. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith received orders from Gage on the afternoon of April 18th with instructions that he would not read them until his troops were underway. He was to proceed from Boston with the utmost speed and secrecy to Concord, where he was to seize and destroy all military stores, but he was also ordered to take care that his soldiers did not plunder the inhabitants or hurt private property. Gage used his discretion not to issue orders for the arrest of rebel leaders, as he feared doing so might spark an uprising. The rebellion's leaders, with the exception of Paul Revere and Joseph Warren, had all left Boston by April 8th. They had received word of Leggie's instructions of the arrest to Gage from sources in London well before the order reached General Gage. Samuel Adams and John Hancock had fled Boston to the home of one of Hancock's relatives in Lexington, Jonas Clark, where they thought they would be safe from the imminent threat of arrest. The Massachusetts militias had indeed been gathering a stock of weapons, powder, and supplies at Concord and much further west at Worcester. An expedition by the British from Boston to Concord was highly anticipated after a large contingent of regulars alarmed the countryside by the expedition from Boston to Watertown on March 30th. The colonists were also aware that April 19th would be the date of the expedition, despite Gage's efforts to keep the details hidden from all the British rank and file and even from the officers who would command the mission. There has been reasonable speculation that the confidential source of the intelligence was Gage's New Jersey-born wife, Margaret Gage, who had sympathies with the colonial cause and a friendly relationship with Joseph Warren. Between 9 and 10 p.m. on the night of April 19th, Joseph Warren told Paul Revere and William Dawes that the British troops were about to embark in boats from Boston bound for Cambridge and the road to Lexington and Concord. Warren's intelligence suggested that the most likely objectives of the regulars' movements later that night was to capture Adams and Hancock. They did not worry about the probability of regulars marching to Concord since the supplies were safe, but they did think their leaders in Lexington were unaware of the potential danger that night. Revere and Dawes were sent out to warn them and to alert colonial militias in nearby towns. Dawes covered the southern land route by horseback across Boston Neck over the Great Bridge to Lexington. Revere first gave instructions to signal Charlestown using lanterns hung in the steeple of Boston's Old North Church. He then traveled the northern water route, crossing the mouth of the Charles River by rowboat, slipping past the British warship HMS Somerset at anchor. Crossing was banned at that hour, but Revere safely landed in Charlestown and rode west to Lexington, warning almost every house along the route. Additional riders were sent north from Charlestown. After arriving in Lexington, Revere, Dawes, Hancock, and Adams discussed the situation with the militia assembled there. They believed that the forces leaving the city were too large for the sole task of arresting 2 men, and that Concord was the main target. The Lexington men dispatched riders to the surrounding town, and Revere's and Dawes continued along the road to Concord, accompanied by Samuel Prescott. In Lincoln, they ran into a British patrol led by Major Mitchell. Revere was captured, and Dawes was thrown from his horse, and only Prescott escaped to reach Concord. Additional riders were sent out from Concord upon his arrival. The ride of Revere, Dawes, and Prescott triggered a flexible system of alarm and muster that was put into place months before in reaction to the colonials' impotent response to the powder alarm. This system was an improvised version of an old notification system from the times of emergency used during the Indian Wars. In addition to messenger riders, bells, drums, alarm guns, bonfires, and a trumpet were used for rapid communication from town to town, notifying rebels in dozens of East Massachusetts towns that they should muster their militia. This system was so effective that people in towns 25 miles away from Boston were aware of the regulars' movements while they were still unloading boats at Cambridge. These early warnings would play an important role in the battle to come and the ability of the militia to inflict casualties on the British regulars later in the day. Adams and Hancock were eventually moved to safety, first to what is now Burlington and later to Billerica. Around dusk, Gage called for his senior officer at the Province House. He informed them that instructions from Legge had arrived and ordered him to take action against the Colonials. He also told them that senior colonel of his regiment, Lieutenant Colonel Smith, would command, with Major John Pitcairn as his executive officer. This meeting adjourned around 8:30. The discussion of the people around Boston was turning to the unusual movements of British soldiers around town. General Gage was told of the talk around town and issued orders to prevent messengers getting out of town, but was late to stop Revere and Dawes from leaving. The British regulars, around 700 infantry, were drawn from 11 of Gage's 13 regiments, occupying Boston. Major Pitcairn commanded 10 elite light infantry companies, and Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Barnard commanded 11 grenadier companies under the overall command of Lieutenant Colonel Smith. Of the troop, 350 were grenadier companies and 320 were light infantry. Each company had its own lieutenant, but a majority of the captains commanding were volunteers attached to them at the last minute, drawn from all the regiments stationed in Boston. This lack of familiarity between commander and company would cause problems during the battle. British began to awaken their troops at 9 p.m. on the night of April 18th and assembled them on the water's edge on the western end of Boston Common by 10 p.m. Colonel Smith was late arriving, and there was no organized boat loading operation, resulting in confusion at the staging areas. The boats used were naval barges that were packed so tightly there was no room to sit down. When they disembarked near Phipps Farm in Cambridge, it was into waist-deep water at midnight. After a lengthy halt to unload their gear, the regulars began the 17-mile march to Concord at 2 a.m. During the wait, they were provided with extra ammunition, cold salt pork, and hard sea biscuits. They did not carry knapsacks since they were not encamped. They carried their haversacks or food bags, canteens, muskets, accoutrements, and marched off in wet, muddy shoes and soggy uniforms. As they marched through Matomi, sounds of the colonial alarms throughout the countryside caused the few officers who were aware of their mission to realize they had lost the element of surprise. At about 3 a.m., Colonel Smith sent Major Pitcairn ahead with 6 companies of light infantry under orders to quick march to Concord. At about 4 a.m., Smith made the wise but late decision to send back a messenger to Boston for reinforcements. Although often styled a battle, in reality the engagement at Lexington was a minor brush or skirmish. After waiting most of the night with no sign of British troops and wondering if the warning had been true, at about 4:15 a.m., Captain John Parker, a French and Indian War veteran, was the leader of the militia, got his confirmation as Thaddeus Bowman, the last scout he had sent out, rode up and told him they were coming, not only, but coming in force and were close. Captain Parker was clearly aware that he was outmatched and was not prepared to sacrifice his men for no purpose. He knew that most of the colonists' powder and military supplies at Concord had already been hidden and no war had been declared. He also knew the British had gone on such expeditions in Massachusetts before, found nothing, and marched back to Boston. Parker had every reason to expect that would occur again. The regulars would march to Concord, find nothing, and return to Boston, tired but empty-handed. He positioned his men in parade ground formation on Lexington Common. They were in plain sight, not hiding behind walls and not blocking the road to Concord. They made a show of political and military determination, but no effort to prevent the march of the regulars. As the regulars' advanced guard under Pitcairn entered Lexington at sunrise, April 19, 1775, about 80 Lexington militia men emerged from Buckham Tavern and stood in ranks on the village common, watching them, and between 40 and 100 spectators watched from alongside the road. Rather than turn left towards Concord, Marine Lieutenant Jesse Adair, at the head of the advance guard, decided on his own to protect the flank of the British column by first turning right and then leading the companies onto the common itself in a confused effort to surround and disarm the militia. Major Pitcairn arrived from the rear of the advanced force and led his 3 companies to the left and halted them. The remaining companies under Colonel Smith lay further down the road to Boston. A British officer, either Pitcairn or Lieutenant William Sutherland, then rode forward waving his sword and called out for the assembled militia to disperse, and may have also ordered them to lay down their arms by some witnesses. Captain Parker told his men instead to disperse and go home, but because of the confusion and the yelling around the square, the raspiness of his voice from tuberculosis, some did not hear him. Some left very slowly, and none laid down their arms. Both Parker and Pitcairn ordered their men to hold fire, but a shot was fired from an unknown source. Who fired the shot that erupted the violence? There is no hard evidence to show exactly who it was, but there are some theories from all sides. Some witnesses among the regulars reported the shot was fired by colonial onlooker from behind a hedge or around the corner of the tavern. Some observers reported a mounted British officer fired first. Both sides generally agreed that the initial shot did not come from the men on the ground facing each other. Some witnesses on each side claimed that someone from the other side fired the shot, but many more claimed to not know where the shot came from. Where the shot came from may never be known, but it was fired, and the powder keg that had been brewing in Massachusetts exploded into the Revolutionary War. Witnesses at the scene described several intermittent shots fired by both sides before the line of regulars began to fire volleys without receiving orders to do so. A few of the militiamen believed at first that the regulars were firing only powder with no ball, but when they realized the truth, few if any of the militia managed to load and return fire. The rest ran for their lives. The regulars then charged forward with bayonets. Captain Parker's cousin, Jonas, was run through. 8 Lexington men were killed and 10 were wounded. Jonathan Harrington, fatally wounded by a British musket ball, managed to crawl back to his home and died on his own doorstep. One wounded man was Prince Easterbrook, a black slave who was serving in the militia. The companies under Pitcairn's command got beyond their officers' control because they were unaware of the actual purpose of the day's mission. They fired in different directions and prepared to enter private homes. Colonel Smith, who was arriving with the remainder of the regulars, heard musket fire and rode forward from the grenadier column to see the action. He quickly found a drummer and ordered them to beat assembly. The grenadiers arrived shortly after, and once order was restored among the soldiers, the light infantry was permitted to fire a victory volley, after which the column was reformed and marched towards Concord. In response to the raised alarm, the militiamen at Concord and Lincoln had mustered in Concord. They received reports of firing in Lexington and were not sure whether to wait until reinforcements by troops from towns nearby or to stay and defend the town or move east and free the British army from superior terrain. A column of militia marched down the road to Lexington to meet the British, traveling about 1.5 miles until they met the approaching column of regulars. As the regulars numbered about 700 and the militia at this time only about 250, the militia turned around and marched back to Concord, preceding the regulars by a distance of about 500 yards. The militia retreated to the ridge overlooking the town, and their officers discussed what to do next. Caution prevailed, and Colonel James Barrett withdrew from the center of town and led his men across the North Bridge to a hill about a mile north, where they could continue to watch the troops' movements of the British and the activities in the town center. This step would be fortuitous as the ranks of the militia continued to grow as Minutemen companies arrived from the western towns joined them there. When the British troops arrived in the village of Concord, Lieutenant Colonel Smith divided them to carry out Gage's orders. The 10th Regiment's companies of grenadiers secured the South Bridge under command of Captain Munday Pole, with 7 companies of light infantry under Captain Parsons, numbering about 100, secured the North Bridge, where they were visible across the cleared fields to the assembled militia companies. Captain Parsons took 4 companies from the 5th, 23rd, 38th, and 52nd Regiments up the road 2 miles beyond the North Bridge to search Barrett's farm, where intelligence indicated supplies would be found. 2 companies from the 4th and 10th Regiments were stationed to guard their return route, and 1 company from the 43rd remained to guard the bridge itself. These companies, which were under the relatively inexperienced command of Captain Walter Lorry, were aware that they were significantly outnumbered by the 400-plus militiamen. The concerned Captain Lorry sent a messenger to Lieutenant Colonel Smith requesting reinforcements. Using detained information provided by Loyalist spies, the Grenadier Company searched the small town for military supplies. When they arrived at Ephraim Jones's Taverns by the jail on South Bridge Road, they found the door barred and Jones refused them entry. According to reports provided by local Loyalists, Pitcairn knew cannon had been buried on the property, and Jones was ordered at gunpoint to show them where the guns were buried. These turned out to be 3 massive cannon firing 24-pound shot. They were much too heavy to be used defensively, but very effective against fortifications, with significant range to bombard Boston from the parts of the nearby mainland. The Grenadiers smashed trunnions or mounting points of these guns so they could not be mounted. They also burned the gun carriage found in the village meeting house, and when the fire spread to the meeting house, local resident Martha Moulton persuaded the soldiers to help in a bucket brigade to save the building. Nearly 100 barrels of flour and salted food were thrown into the nearby mill pond, as were 550 pounds of musket balls. Of the damage done, only the damage to the cannon was significant. All the shot and much of the food was recovered when the British left. During the search, the regulars were generally scrupulous in their treatment of locals, included paying for food and drink consumed. This excessive politeness was used to the advantage by the locals, who were able to misdirect searches from several smaller caches of military supplies. Barrett's farm had been an arsenal a few weeks before, but few weapons remained now, and according to a family legend, they were quickly buried in the furrows to look like a crop had been planted. The troops sent there did not find any supplies of significance. Colonel Barrett's troops, upon seeing smoke rising from the village square as the British burned cannon cartridges, and seeing only a few light infantry companies directly below them, decided to march back towards town from their vantage point at Punkatasset Hill to a lower, closer, flat hilltop about 300 yards from the North Bridge. As the militia advanced, the 2 British companies from the 4th and 10th Regiments that held the position near the road retreated to the bridge and yielded the hill to Barrett's men. 5 full companies of Minutemen and 5 more of militia from Acton, Concord, Bedford, and Lincoln occupied the hill, as more groups of men streaming in, totaling at least 400 against Captain Lorry's light infantry companies, a force of totaling 90 to 95 men. Barrett ordered the Massachusetts men to form one long line, 2 abreast, on the highway leading down to the bridge, and then he called for another consultation. While overlooking North Bridge from the top of the hill, Barrett, Lieutenant Colonel John Robinson of Westford, and the other captains discussed possible advance on the bridge. Barrett asked Captain Isaac Davis, who commanded a company of Minutemen from Acton, if his company would be willing to lead the advance. Davis responded, "I'm not afraid to go, and I haven't a man that's afraid to go." Barrett told the men to load their weapons, but not to fire unless fired upon, and then ordered them to advance. Lorry ordered the British companies guarding the bridge to retreat across it. One officer then tried to pull up loose planks of the bridge to impede the colonial advance, but Major Buttrick began to yell at the regulars to stop harming the bridge. The Minutemen and militia from Concord, Acton, Lincoln, and a handful of Westwood Minutemen advanced in column formation 2 by 2, led by Major Buttrick and Lieutenant Colonel Robinson, then Captain Davis, on the light infantry, keeping to the road since it was surrounded by a spring floodwaters of the Concord River. Captain Lorry then made a poor tactical decision. Since his summons for help had not produced any results, he ordered his men to form positions for street firing behind the bridge in a column running perpendicular to the river. This formation was appropriate for sending a large volume of fire into a narrow alley between the buildings of a city, but not for an open path behind a bridge. Confusion reigned as regulars retreated over the bridge, tried to form up in the street firing positions of the other troops. Lieutenant Sutherland, who was in the rear of the formation, saw Laurie's mistake and ordered flankers to be sent out. But as he was from a company different from the men under his command, only 3 soldiers obeyed him. The remainder tried as best as they could, in the confusion, to follow the orders of the superior officer. A shot rang out. It was likely a shot fired by a panic-exhausted soldier from the 43rd, according to Captain Laurie's report to his commander after the fight. 2 other regulars fired immediately after that. Shots blasted the rivers, and then the narrow group up front, possibly thinking the order fire has come, fired a ragged volley before Laurie could stop them. 2 of the Acton Minutemen, Private Abner Hosmer and Captain Isaac Davis, who were at the head of the line marching to the bridge, were hit and killed instantly. 4 more men were wounded. Major Buttrick then yelled to the militia, "Fire, for God's sakes! Fellow soldiers, fire!" At this point, the lines were separated by the Concord River and the bridge, and were only 50 yards apart. The few front rows of colonists, bound by the road and blocked from forming a line of fire, managed to fire over each other's heads and shoulders at the regulars massed across the bridge. 4 of the 8 British officers and sergeants who were leading from the front of their troops were wounded by the volley of musket fire. At least 3 privates, Thomas Patrick Smith, Patrick Gray, and James Hall, all from the 4th Regiment, were killed or mortally wounded, and 9 were wounded. The regulars found themselves trapped in a situation where they were both outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Lacking effective leadership and terrified at the superior numbers of the enemies, with their spirit broken and likely not having experienced combat before, they abandoned their wounded and fled to the safety of the approaching grenadier companies coming from the town center. Isolated Captain Parsons and the company searching the arms at Barrett's farm. The colonists were stunned by their success. No one had actually believed either side would shoot to kill the other. Some advanced, many more retreated, and some went home to see the safety of their homes and families. Colonel Barrett eventually began to recover control. He moved some of the militia back to the hilltop 300 yards away and sent Major Buttrick with some others across the bridge to a defensive position on the hill behind a stone wall. Lieutenant Colonel Smith heard the exchange of fire from his position in the town moments after he received the request for reinforcements from Laurie. He quickly assembled 2 companies of grenadiers to lead towards the North Bridge himself. As the troops marched, they met the shattered remnants of the 3 light infantry companies running towards them. Smith was concerned about the 4 companies that had been at Barrett's, since their route was now unprotected. When he saw the Minutemen in the distance behind their wall, he halted his 2 companies and moved forward with only his officers to take a closer look. One of the Minutemen behind the wall observed, "If we had fired, I believe we could have killed almost every officer there was in front, but we had no orders to fire, and not a gun was fired." During a tense standoff lasting about 10 minutes, a mentally ill local man named Elias Brown wandered through both sides selling hard cider. At this point, the detachment of regulars sent to Barrett's farm marched back from their fruitless search of that area. They passed through the now mostly deserted battlefield and saw dead and wounded comrades lying on the bridge. There was one who looked to them as if they had been scalped, which angered and shocked the British soldiers. They crossed the bridge and returned to town at 11:30 a.m., under the watchful eyes of the colonists, who continued to maintain defensive positions. The regulars continued to search for and destroy colonial military supplies in the town, ate lunch, reassembled for marching, and left Concord after noon. This delay in departure gave colonial men from outlying towns additional time to reach the road back to Boston. Lieutenant Colonel Smith, concerned about the safety of his men, sent flankers to follow a ridge and protect his forces from the roughly 1,000 colonials now in the field as the British marched east out of Concord. The ridge ended near Miriam's Corner, a crossroad about 2 miles outside the village of Concord, where the main road came to a bridge across a small stream. To cross the narrow bridge, the British had to pull the flankers back into the main column and close ranks to a mere 3 soldiers abreast. Colonial militia companies arriving from the north and east had converged at this point and presented a clear numerical advantage over the regulars. The British were now witnessing once again what General Gage had hoped to avoid by dispatching the expedition in secrecy and in the dark of night: the ability of colonial militiamen to rise and converge by the thousand when British forces ventured out of Boston. As the last of the British column marched over the narrow bridge, the British rear guard wheeled and fired a volley at the colonial militiamen, who had been firing irregularly and ineffectively from a distance, but now had closed to within musket range. The colonists returned fire, this time with deadly effect. 2 regulars were killed and perhaps 6 wounded, with no colonial casualties. Smith sent out flanking troops again after crossing the small bridge. On Brooks Hill, also known as Hardy's Hill, about 1 mile past Merriam's Corner, nearly 500 militiamen had assembled to the south of the road, awaiting the opportunity to fire down upon the British column on the road below. Smith's leading forces charged up the hill to drive them off, but the colonists did not withdraw, inflicting significant casualties on the attackers. Smith withdrew his men from Brooks Hill, and the column continued on to another small bridge in Lincoln at Brooks Tavern, where more militia companies intensified the attack from the north side of the road. The regulars soon reached a point in the road now referred to as the Bloody Angle, where the road rises and curves sharply to the left through the lightly wooded area. At this place, the militia company for Woburn had positioned themselves on the southeast side of the bend in the road in a rocky, lightly wooded field. Additional militiamen flowed parallel to the road from the engagement of Merriam's Corner, positioned themselves at the northwest side of the road, catching the British in a crossfire, while other militia companies on the road closed from behind to attack. Some 500 yards further along, the road took another sharp curve, this time to the right, and again the British column was caught by another large force of militiamen firing from both sides. In passing through these 2 sharp curves, the British force lost 30 soldiers, killed or wounded, and 4 colonial militia were also killed, including Captain Jonathan Wilson of Bedford, Captain Nathan Wareham of Billica, Lieutenant John Bacon of Nattrick, and Daniel Thompson of Woburn. The British soldiers escaped by breaking into a trot, a pace that the colonials could not maintain through the woods and swampy terrain. Colonial forces on the road itself behind the British were too densely packed and disorganized to mount more than a harassing attack from the rear. As militia forces from other towns continued to arrive, the colonial forces had risen to about 2,000 men. The road now straightened to the east, with cleared fields and orchards along the sides. Lieutenant Colonel Smith sent out flankers again, who succeeded in trapping some militia from behind and inflicting casualties. British casualties were also mounting from these engagements and from persistent long-range fire from the militiamen, and the exhausted British were running out of ammunition. When the British column neared the boundary between Lincoln and Lexington, it encountered another ambush from a hill overlooking the road, set by Captain John Parker's Lexington militiamen, including some of them bandaged up from their encounter in Lexington earlier in the day. At this point, Lieutenant Colonel Smith was wounded in the thigh and knocked from his horse. Major John Pitcairn assumed effective command of the column and set light infantry companies up the hill to clear the militia forces. The light infantry cleared 2 additional hills as the column continued east, the Bluff and Fisk Hill, and took still more casualties from ambushes set by fresh militia companies joining in the battle. In one of the musket volleys from the colonial soldiers, Major Pitcairn's horse bolted in fright, throwing Pitcairn to the ground and injuring his arm. Now both principal leaders of the expedition were injured or unhorsed, and the men were tired, thirsty, and exhausting their ammunition. A few surrounded or were captured. Some now broke formation and ran forward towards Lexington. In the words of one British officer, "We began to run rather than retreat in order. We attempted to stop the men from them too deep, but to no purpose. The confusion increased rather than lessened. The officers got in front and presented their bayonets, and told them if they advanced, they would die. Upon this, they began to form up under heavy fire. Only one British officer remained uninjured among the 3 companies at the head of the British column as it approached Lexington's center. He understood the column's precarious situation. He stated, "There were very few men that had ammunition left, and so fatigued that we could not keep flanking parties out. So we must soon have laid down our arms or been picked off by the rebels at their pleasure." He then heard cheering further ahead. A full brigade, about 1,000 men with artillery under the command of Earl Percy, had arrived to rescue them. It was about 2:30 p.m. The British column had now been on the march since 2 o'clock in the morning. In their accounts afterwards, British officers and soldiers alike noted their frustration that the colonial militiamen fired at them from behind trees and stone walls rather than confronting them in large linear formations in the European style of warfare. This image of the individual colonial farmer, musket in hand and fighting under his own command, has also been fostered in American myth, chasing the redcoats down the lane, crossing the fields to emerge again, only pausing to fire and load. To the contrary, beginning at the North Bridge and throughout the British retreat, the colonial militias repeatedly operated as coordinated companies, even when dispersed to take advantage of cover. Reflecting on a British experience that day, Earl Percy understood the significance of the American tactics. He stated, "During the whole affair, the rebels attacked us in very scattered, irregular manner, but with prevalence and resolution, nor did they ever dare to form into a regular body. Indeed, they knew too well what was proper to do so. Whoever took upon them as an irregular mob will find himself much mistaken. They have men amongst them who knew very well what they are about, having been employed as rangers against the Indians and Canadians, and this country being much covered with wood and hilly is very advantageous to their method of fighting." General Gage had anticipated that Lieutenant Colonel Smith's expedition might require reinforcements, so Gage drafted orders for reinforcement units to assemble at Boston at 4 a.m. But in his obsession for secrecy, Gage had sent only one copy of the orders to the adjutant of the 1st Brigade, whose servant had left the envelope on a table. Also, at about 4 a.m., the British column was within 3 miles of Lexington, and Lieutenant Colonel Smith now had a clear indication that all element of surprise had been lost and alarm was spreading through the countryside. So he had sent that rider back to Boston with a request for reinforcements. At about 5 a.m., the rider reached Boston, and the 1st Brigade was ordered to assemble. The line infantry companies of the 4th, 23rd, and 47th Regiments, and a battalion of Royal Marines under the command of Earl Percy. Unfortunately for the British, once again, only one copy of the orders was sent to each commander, and the order for the Royal Marines was delivered to the desk of Major John Pitcairn, who was already on the Lexington Common with Smith's column at that hour. After these delays, Percy's brigade, about 1,000 strong, left Boston at about 8:45 a.m., headed towards Lexington. Along the way, the story is told, they marched to the tune of Yankee Doodle to taunt the inhabitants of the area. By the Battle of Bunker Hill, less than 2 months later, the song would become a popular anthem for colonial forces. Percy took the land route across Boston Neck and over the Great Bridge, with some quick-thinking colonists had stripped of its planking to delay the British. His men then came upon an absent-minded tutor at Harvard College and asked him which road would take them to Lexington. The Harvard man, apparently oblivious to the reality of what was happening around him, showed him the proper road without thinking. He was later compelled to leave the country for inveterate supporting the enemy. Percy's troops arrived in Lexington at about 2 p.m. They could hear gunfire in the distance as they set up their cannon and deployed lines of regulars on high ground with commanding views of the town. Colonel Smith's men, approaching like a fleeing mob, with the full complement of colonial militia in close formation pursuing them. Percy ordered his artillery to open fire at extreme range, dispersing the colonial militiamen. Smith's men collapsed with exhaustion once they reached the safety of Percy's lines. Against the advice of his master of ordnance, Percy had left Boston without spare ammunition for his men or for the 2 artillery pieces they brought with them, thinking the extra wagons would slow him down. Each man in Percy's brigade had only 36 rounds, and each artillery piece was supplied with only a few rounds carried in side boxes. After Percy had left the city, Gage directed 2 ammunition wagons guarded by 1 officer and 13 men to follow. This convoy was intercepted by a small party of older veteran militiamen still on the alarm list, who could not join the militia companies because they were well over 60 years of age. These men rose up in ambush and demanded the surrender of the wagon, but the regulars ignored them and drove their horses in. The old men opened fire, shot the lead horses, killed 2 sergeants, and wounded the officer. The British survivors ran, and 6 of them threw their weapons into a pond before they surrendered. Percy assumed control of the combined forces of about 1,700 men and let them rest, eat, drink, and have their wounds tended at a field hospital in Monroe Tavern before resuming the march. They set out from Lexington at about 3:30 p.m. in a formation that emphasized defense along the sides and rear of the column. Wounded regulars rode on the cannon and were forced to hop off when fired at gatherings of militia. Percy's men were often surrounded, but they had the tactical advantage of interior lines. Percy could shift his units more easily to where they were needed, while the colonial militia were required to move around the outside of his formation. Percy placed Smith's men in the middle of the column, while the 23rd Regiment's line companies made up the column's rear guard. Because of information provided by Smith and Pitcairn about how the Americans were attacking, Percy ordered the rear guard to be rotated every mile or so to allow some of the troops to rest briefly. Flanking companies were sent to both sides of the road, and a powerful force of Marines acted as the vanguard to clear the road ahead. During the respite in Lexington, Brigadier General William Hurth arrived and took command of the militia. Earlier in the day, he had traveled first to Watertown to discuss tactics with Joseph Warren, who had left Boston that morning, and other members of the Massachusetts Committee of Safety. Hurth and Warren reacted to Percy's artillery and flankers by ordering the militiamen to avoid close formations that would attract cannon fire. Instead, they surrounded Percy's marching square with a moving ring of skirmishers at the distance to inflict maximum casualties at minimum risk. A few mounted militiamen on the road would dismount, fire muskets at the opposing regulars, then remount and gallop ahead to repeat the tactic. The unmounted militia would often fire from long range, in the hope of hitting somebody in the main column of soldiers on the road and surviving, since both British and Colonials used muskets with an effective combat range of about 50 yards. Infantry units would apply pressure to the sides of the British column. When it moved out of range, these units would move around and forward to re-engage the column further down the road. Heath sent messengers out to intercept arriving militia units, directing them to appropriate places along the road to engage the regulars. Some towns sent supply wagons to assist in feeding and rearming the militia. Heath and Warren did lead skirmishers in small actions into battle themselves, but it was the presence of effective leadership that probably had the greatest impact on the success of these tactics. The fighting grew more intense as Percy's forces crossed from Lexington to Menotomy. Fresh militia poured gunfire into the British ranks from a distance, and individual homeowners began to fight from their own property. Marksmen were also concealed in some homes, forcing the British to clear their path of retreat house by house, a soldier's nightmare. Jason Russell pleaded for his friends to fight alongside him to defend his house by saying, "An Englishman's home is his castle." He stayed and was killed in his doorway. His friends, depending on which account is to be believed, either hid in the cellar or died in the house from bullets and bayonets after shooting at the soldiers who followed them in. The Jason Russell house still stands and contained bullet holes from this fight. A militia unit that attempted an ambush from Russell's orchard was caught by flankers, and 11 men were killed, some allegedly after they had surrendered. Percy lost control of his men, and many regulars began to commit atrocities to repay for the supposed scalping at the North Bridge and for their own casualties at the hands of a distant, often unseen enemy. Based on the word of Pitcairn and other wounded officers from Smith's command, Percy had learned that Minutemen were using stone walls, trees, and buildings, and these more thickly settled towns closer to Boston to hide behind and shoot at the column. He ordered the flank companies to clear the colonial militiamen out of such places. Many of the junior officers in the flank parties had difficulty stopping their exhausted, enraged men from killing everyone they found inside these buildings. For example, 2 innocent drunks who refused to hide in the basement of a tavern in Minnetonka were killed only because they were suspected to be involved in the day's events, although many of the accounts of ransacking and burnings were exaggerated later by colonists for propaganda value and to get financial compensation from the colonial government. It is certainly true that taverns along the road were ransacked and the liquor stolen by the troops, who in some cases became drunk themselves. One church's communion silver was stolen, but was later recovered after it was sold in Boston. Aged Minnetonka resident Samuel Whitmore killed 3 regulars before he was attacked by a British contingent and left for dead. He recovered from his wounds and later died in 1793 at the age of 98. All told, far more blood was shed in Minnetonka and Cambridge than elsewhere that day. The colonists lost 25 men killed and 9 wounded, and the British lost 40 killed and 80 wounded, with the 47th Foot and Marines suffering the highest casualties, each about half of the day's fatalities. The British troops crossed the Minnetonka River, also known as Alewife Brook, into Cambridge, and the fight grew more intense. Fresh militia arrived in close array instead of in a scattered formation, and Percy used his 2 artillery pieces and flankers at a crossroads called Washington's Corner to inflict heavy damage on them. Earlier in the day, Heath had ordered the Great Bridge to be dismantled. Percy's brigade was about to approach the broken-down bridge and a riverbank filled with militia when Percy directed his troops down a narrow track, now Beach Street near present-day Porter Square, and onto the road to Charlestown. The militia, now numbering about 4,000, were unprepared for this movement, and the circle of fire was broken. An American force moved to occupy Prospect Hill, in modern-day Somerville, which dominated the road, but Percy moved his cannon to the front and dispersed them with the last rounds of ammunition. A large militia force arrived from Salem and Marblehead. They might have cut Percy's route in Charleston, but the men halted at nearby Winter Hill and allowed the British to escape. Some accused the commander of this force, Colonel Timothy Pinkerton, of permitting the troops to pass through because he still hoped to avoid war by preventing a total defeat of the regulars. Pinkerton later claimed that he had stopped on Heath's orders, but Heath denied this. It was nearly dark when Pinkerton's Marines defended a final attack on Percy's rear as they entered Charlestown. The regulars took up strong position on the hills of Charlestown. Some of them had been without sleep for 2 days and had marched 40 miles in 21 hours, 8 hours of which had been spent under fire. But now they held the high ground, and protected by heavy guns from HMS Somerset, Gage quickly sent over line companies of 2 fresh regiments, the 10th and 64th, to occupy the high ground in Charleston and build fortifications. Although they were begun, the fortifications were never completed and would later be the starting point for the militia works built 2 months later in June before the Battle of Bunker Hill. General Heath studied the position of the British Army and decided to withdraw the militia to Cambridge. In the morning, Boston was surrounded by a huge militia army numbering over 15,000, which had marched from throughout New England. Unlike the powder alarm, the rumors of spilled blood were true, and the Revolutionary War had begun. Now under the leadership of General Artemas Ward, who arrived on the 20th and replaced General William Heath, they formed a siege line extended from Chelsea around the peninsula of Boston and Charlestown to Roxbury, effectively surrounding Boston on 3 sides. In the days immediately following, the siege of colonial forces grew, as militiamen from New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut arrived on the scene. The Second Continental Congress adopted these men into the beginnings of the colonial army. Even now, after open warfare had started, Gage still refused to impose martial law in Boston. he persuaded the town selectmen to surrender all private weapons in return for promising that any inhabitants could leave town. The battle was not a major one in the terms of tactics or casualties. However, in terms of supporting the British political strategy behind the Intolerable Acts, the military strategy behind the powder alarms, the battle was a significant failure because the expedition contributed to the fighting and was pretended to prevent, and because few weapons were actually seized. The battle was followed by a war for British public opinion. Within 4 days of the battle, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress had collected scores of sworn testimony from militiamen and from British prisoners. When word leaked out a week later after the battle that Gage was sending his official description of the events to London, the Provincial Congress sent a packet of these detailed depositions signed by over 100 participants in the events on a faster ship. The documents were presented to a sympathetic official and printed by London newspapers 2 weeks before Gage's report had arrived. Gage's official report was too vague on particulars to influence anyone's opinion. George Germain, no friend of the colonists, wrote, "The Bostonians are in the right to make the king's troops the aggressors and claim a victory." Politicians in London tended to blame Gage for the conflict instead of their own policies and instructions. The British troops in Boston variously blamed General Gage and Colonel Smith for the failures at Lexington and Concord. And that's where we're going to end this week's episode. I wanted to spend more time on the battles of Lexington and Concord because they're so important. They're the start of the war, first shots, first casualties. Everything's coming to a head. We finally see what's going to come. Next week, we're going to start on the Boston campaign, which is going to be the Siege of Boston, the Battle of Bunker Hill, and we're going to go on from there. I'm going to try to spend as much time as I can on each event, so this may be a 4-part series, because the events of the Revolutionary War are very important, not only for the war itself, but for future engagements like the War of 1812. Thanks for listening this week. I hope to see you next week. Remember to like our page on Facebook, just search the History Desk. And if you would like to support the page, you can do so on Patreon. Just search the History Desk. Oh, and I have 2 reading suggestions. If you would like to know more about these topics, Paul Revere's Ride by David Hackett Fischer is a great read. Some very great information about Paul Revere and not only his ride, but things also that he did. And The Road to Concord, How 4 Stolen Cannon Ignited the Revolutionary War by J.L. Bell. And if you get the book from the history list, you can actually get this book signed by J.L. Bell himself, if you would like. So until next week, never stop reading, never stop learning, and we hope to see you again next week.